From the moment we are born, we are taught to build something, a sense of self. We are handed names, stories, roles, and expectations. These things begin to wrap around us like layers of clothing. First, we are sons, daughters. Then students, friends, workers. We become achievers, failures, artists, thinkers, introverts, extroverts. Every label tightens the illusion. Every definition deepens the belief that we are something fixed. This is how the ego forms. Not as something evil, but as a necessary tool to function in a world that demands identity. But then something happens. A moment arrives when this carefully constructed identity starts to shake. Maybe it's a loss, a trauma, a question that will not go away, or maybe it's the stillness that comes after years of chasing. The spiritual awakening often begins not with joy, but with a quiet unraveling. Suddenly, the thoughts that once seemed like you begin to feel foreign. The desires that once drove you no longer make sense. The roles you played no longer fit. You watch yourself go through the motions of daily life, but some deep part of you whispers, "This is not me." This is the beginning of ego death. The mind may resist. It will panic, trying to hold on to something, anything that feels familiar. It will say, "You must be someone. You must have a goal. You must protect your name, your place, your importance." And yet, the deeper current of awareness keeps rising. It watches the ego cling. It sees the fear. It sees the struggle. And in this witnessing, the illusion starts to lose its power. Because how can you be the thing that you are now observing? The crumbling of ego is not always violent. Sometimes it is gentle, like a mist lifting in the morning sun. One day, you just stop reacting the same way. You stop needing to defend yourself. You stop being offended by small things, not because you're suppressing emotions, but because the person who needed that drama no longer feels real. You begin to notice how much of your life was a performance for others, for approval, for safety. You begin to question every mask, and in questioning, the mask slips. There's a quiet grief in this stage. A mourning not for a person, but for a version of you that once believed so deeply in its own story. The ego is not your enemy. It is a child that was trying to protect you. It built walls because it feared pain. It wanted control because it feared chaos. It held on tightly because it feared disappearance. And now, as the spiritual awakening deepens, the walls fall, the control loosens, and disappearance becomes transformation. The strange thing is, as the ego dissolves, what remains is not nothingness, but a deeper presence, a spaciousness. You begin to feel connected to something far beyond your personal history. The need to be right becomes less important than the joy of being free. You feel less like a wave and more like the ocean. Thoughts still come, emotions still rise, but they are no longer who you are. They are clouds passing through the sky of your awareness. And in this clarity, you realize the self you were protecting was never solid. It was a college of memories, fears, achievements, wounds, and dreams. A beautiful illusion, useful but not ultimate. When the illusion starts to crumble, it is not the end of you. It is the beginning of something deeper, something quieter, something truer. You begin to live not from identity, but from presence, not from reaction, but from awareness. You do not disappear. You simply stop pretending to be what you are not. When the process of spiritual awakening deepens, it begins to reveal something most people spend their lives avoiding: silence. Not the silence of an empty room or a quiet night, but the silence within. This is a silence that is not defined by the absence of sound, but by the absence of identification. The silence that rises when thought begins to lose its control over your attention. For most of life, the mind has been the loudest voice in the room. It narrates, plans, judges, compares, worries, dreams, remembers, and repeats. It speaks constantly, and so often we listen to it without question. We assume that if a thought appears, it must be true, it must be important, it must be us. But after awakening, something changes. It's not that thoughts disappear, they still come, but your relationship to them transforms. You start to notice the space between thoughts, the gaps, the pauses, the moments when the mind is silent and something else is present, something calm, still, alive. It's subtle at first, a second of stillness here, a breath of peace there. But these glimpses become more frequent. They begin to pull you deeper, and then you realize the truth: the silence was always there. It had been covered by the noise of your own mind. This internal silence carries a kind of weight, but not the heaviness of burden. It is the groundedness of presence. It does not demand anything, it does not argue, it simply is. And once you taste it, you begin to lose interest in the drama of thought. Not because thoughts are bad, but because they are temporary. The silence does not fluctuate, it does not lie, it does not feed your insecurity or amplify your pride. It does not or pull, it simply allows. This silence is not cold, it is not distant. It is full of warmth, like standing in the sun with your eyes closed. There is no need to explain it, define it, or even understand it. You feel it, you rest in it, and this resting becomes your new foundation. Instead of chasing clarity through thinking, you begin to trust in what arises from stillness. You begin to live in a way where silence is not a break from life, but the source of life. In this space, insight appears naturally. Understanding blossoms without effort. Compassion flows without condition. Actions arise without attachment to outcome. The ego finds this silence uncomfortable at first. It thrives on stimulation, on reaction, on commentary. So when silence begins to take center stage, the ego may resist. It may throw up thoughts like static on a screen. It may whisper, "This is boring," or "You should be doing something," or "You're losing yourself." But these are the last echoes of a system losing its grip, because the deeper the silence becomes, the more obvious it is that you were never the thoughts to begin with. You are the one who is aware of them. There is a beauty in watching a thought rise and fall without needing to follow it, a freedom in seeing a fear arise and not become it. The silence gives you distance, and in that distance, there is clarity. From this silence, you can see more clearly how much of your suffering came not from life, but from your interpretation of life, the stories you told yourself, the assumptions you believed, the identities you clung to. And as those dissolve, you find yourself grounded in something more real than any belief, the present moment. The silence teaches without words. It heals without techniques. It transforms not by adding anything new, but by removing what is false. And what remains is you, not the image, not the name, not the history, but the awareness itself. This internal stillness becomes your sanctuary, your compass, your teacher. It allows you to listen, not just to others, but to existence itself. It allows you to feel not just emotions, but the subtle pulse of life beneath every breath, every heartbeat, every step. Eventually, this silence becomes louder than any thought. Not because it shouts, but because it is constant. Thoughts come and go. The silence remains. Thoughts argue. The silence witnesses. Thoughts divide. The silence unifies. And through this transformation, the mind is no longer your master. It becomes your servant. It is used when needed and then set down like a tool after the work is done. You live not to feed the mind, but to express the silence through action, speech, and presence. And each moment becomes a return, not to something new, but to what has always been waiting beneath the noise. There comes a moment on the spiritual path when the desire to control, to shape, to force life into a certain direction simply dissolves. This dissolution is not something the mind plans. It does not come through strategy or effort. It arises as a natural byproduct of ego death when the realization sets in that much of what we tried to control was never truly in our hands. Control was a comfort, a protection, a veil between ourselves and the raw, unfolding nature of life. But once the illusion of ego thins, once the false self begins to fade, a deeper force takes its place: surrender. This surrender is not weakness. It is not giving up. It is not passivity. It is an opening. It is an inner shift from resistance to receptivity, from pushing to allowing, from grasping to trusting. Before awakening, life is often lived through the lens of willpower, of effort, of striving. The ego builds plans, timelines, ambitions, and goals. It measures success by outcome. It fears failure. It manipulates the present to create a future it can be proud of. But this approach to life carries a weight, a burden, a sense of never being at ease. Even the victories feel hollow when they are achieved through constant tension. When surrender becomes a way of life, that tension begins to release. There is a softening first in the mind, then in the heart, and eventually in the entire being. You start to notice how much of your suffering came not from what was happening, but from your resistance to it. The need to control outcomes, to manage how others see you, to force things to unfold according to your expectations. All of it begins to fall away. And in its place, there is space. Space to breathe, space to be, space to listen to life instead of constantly talking over it with your thoughts. Surrender does not mean you stop acting. It does not mean you abandon responsibility or float through life without intention. It means you act from presence, not from fear. You move in harmony with what is instead of in constant friction with it. When something happens that the mind labels as unwanted, you don't collapse or panic. You pause. You breathe. You observe. You feel. And then, from this deeper awareness, the next step reveals itself, not because you forced it, but because you allowed it. This kind of surrender cannot be faked. The ego can try to imitate surrender using phrases like, "I'm letting go," while still secretly holding on. But true surrender is unmistakable. It feels like standing in the middle of a storm and realizing you are the sky, not the wind. It is not a decision made once. It is a continual process. Life will keep presenting opportunities to let go of expectations, of attachments, of identities, of pain. And with each letting go, you sink deeper into truth. Surrender is also the place where healing begins. When you stop resisting what is, you stop feeding your inner conflict. The energy that was once spent on control becomes available for awareness, for compassion, for understanding. You begin to feel emotions that were previously buried. You begin to see patterns that were once invisible, and in seeing them clearly without judgment, they begin to dissolve. Not because you fixed them, but because you stopped running from them. You let them be. You allowed them to move through you. And in doing so, you become free. There is also a profound humility in surrender, a recognition that you do not know everything and you do not need to, that life is not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived. This humility is not degrading, it is liberating. It removes the pressure of being perfect, of always having the answers, of constantly proving your worth. You begin to trust something beyond the mind, call it the Tao, the way, the divine, or simply presence. You begin to see how life has its own intelligence, its own rhythm. And the more you align with that rhythm, the more ease begins to enter your life. At first, surrender may feel like a death, a loss of control, a letting go of all the stories that kept you safe. But slowly, as the layers fall away, you begin to notice a quiet power beneath it all, a current that carries you not away from yourself, but deeper into your true self, a stillness that moves, a silence that speaks, a spaciousness that holds everything without resistance. This is the essence of surrender, not a retreat from life, but a merging with it, not a collapse of effort, but a redirection of energy, from fear to trust, from force to flow, from separation to unity. The path of spiritual awakening is not always bathed in light. It does not always feel blissful, nor does it follow the familiar steps of comfort and clarity. When the ego dies, what follows is not just a revelation, but a reckoning. For years, sometimes decades, the ego has been the container, the protector, the storyteller, and when it begins to dissolve, what is left in its place is often not immediate joy, but something raw, open, and unfiltered. A strange mixture of pain, emptiness, and a profound sense of freedom arises all at once, and it cannot be avoided. It must be sat with, felt fully, allowed to express itself without judgment. Pain arises first as the mind begins to mourn its own illusion. The identity you once believed was you, full of goals, fears, successes, trauma, pride, opinions, regrets, starts to disappear like fog in sunlight. And though that identity was often a source of suffering, it was also familiar. There is pain in watching it fade. There is pain in realizing that much of what you once fought for was rooted in fear and illusion. This pain is not punishment, it is purification. It is the soul stretching itself back into its original form after being folded and compressed into something too small for far too long. This kind of pain is not like the pain of external loss. It is subtler, deeper. It is a kind of ache that seems to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. You may feel an existential sadness, a sense of being lost without knowing exactly why. The world continues as usual. People go about their routines, but inside you, a great unlearning is taking place. Pain is a natural response to losing something you once thought was essential, the false self, and with this pain comes emptiness. But this emptiness is misunderstood by the mind. The ego sees emptiness as a threat, as something hollow and void-like. it fears it, but the awakened heart experiences this emptiness differently. It is not a lack, it is a space, a clearing, a quiet vastness where all the noise has fallen away. In this emptiness, there are no roles to play, no labels to uphold, no images to protect, and for a moment that can feel terrifying. Who are you without your story, without your past, without your name, your title, your history? But the emptiness is not there to frighten. It is there to reveal. It shows you that beneath all the doing, all the becoming, all the trying to be someone, there is a field of stillness that has always been untouched. This emptiness is full of potential. It is fertile ground for truth, but only when you stop trying to fill it with more identity. It requires patience. It requires the courage to be still even when the mind wants to escape. You learn to sit in that sacred space of unknowing, and over time it no longer feels empty in the painful sense. It becomes open, spacious, boundless. And then somewhere in the midst of the pain and the emptiness, freedom begins to rise. Not as an event, but as a presence, a quiet realization that you are not bound by your past. You are not trapped in your thoughts. You are not defined by your emotions. You are the one who sees it all. You are the awareness in which everything appears and disappears. This freedom is not something the ego can understand, because it is the very thing the ego was hiding from. The freedom to just be without explanation or justification. The freedom to feel everything without clinging or resisting. The freedom to meet life directly without the filter of fear. It is a paradox. The deeper the emptiness, the greater the space for freedom. The more pain is allowed, the less it controls you. Everything that once seemed opposed, pain and peace, emptiness and fulfillment, letting go and gaining truth, they begin to merge. You see that they were never separate. That true peace includes pain. That true fullness arises from the ability to remain empty. That true freedom comes not from controlling life, but from surrendering to it. On the surface, this coexistence may appear contradictory, but when you sit with it long enough, you begin to feel its harmony. Pain no longer means something is wrong. Emptiness no longer needs to be filled, and freedom no longer requires escape. They dance together. They inform each other. They make space for one another, and through this dance, you begin to feel whole, not because every piece has been found, but because you no longer need to be complete in the way the ego once demanded. The ego is not a flaw in the human system. It is a stage. It develops naturally as a response to the environment, to conditioning, to the needs of survival and identity in a complex world. It is a mask worn so often that eventually it believes itself to be the face. And for a time, it serves a purpose. It helps you navigate, define, protect, and progress. But the very mechanisms that make the ego useful also limit the truth of who you are. It filters life through a narrow lens, one shaped by fear, attachment, judgment, and resistance. So when truth begins to call, the ego must begin to fall. Truth cannot enter a space that is filled with pretense. It does not argue with illusion. It simply waits for illusion to exhaust itself, and that exhaustion is what begins the death of the ego. The mind, tired of protecting an image, begins to surrender. The heart, weary of playing roles, begins to open. The body, burdened by years of tension and defense, begins to release. And in this deep letting go, something else begins to emerge, something quieter, more honest, more vast. The ego operates from separation. It sees the self as isolated, distinct from others, from nature, from life itself. It says, I am this. And in doing so, it defines everything else as not me. This division is the foundation of its existence. But truth is not found in division, it is found in unity. The truth of your being is not a fixed identity, but an ever-present awareness. Not a character in a story, but the space in which all stories rise and fall. The ego cannot access this directly because it must defend itself. Its entire structure is built upon protection, comparison, and reinforcement. It cannot be open and protective at the same time. When the ego begins to dissolve, the fear of death rises, not just the fear of physical death, but the fear of psychological death, the fear that without your roles, your past, your opinions, you will cease to exist. But what is being lost is not the real self. What is being lost is the tension of pretending, the weight of always having to be someone. And what is left in its place is not a blank void, but a presence so natural, so quiet, that it often goes unnoticed until everything else falls away. This presence is the doorway to truth. It does not need to be created, it needs to be uncovered. And the ego stands in the way like covering a mountain. The mountain does not need to grow, only the fog needs to lift. The truth of who you are is not something you arrive at through thinking, through gathering knowledge, or through perfecting the personality. It is something that becomes self-evident when the false is no longer believed. And that is why the ego must die, not to punish, not to remove your uniqueness, but to reveal what has always been underneath. The mind often asks, if I let go of the ego, what will be left of me? The answer is silence. Not silence as in emptiness, but silence as incompleteness. A fullness that needs no commentary. A peace that does not depend on external conditions. A clarity that arises not from figuring things out, but from no longer needing to. In the absence of ego, truth is not a belief or a philosophy, it is a lived experience. It is the moving through your body, the sunlight on your skin, the effortless awareness of each moment untouched by judgment or resistance. Letting the ego die is not about rejecting the mind, but about placing it in its proper role. A tool, not a master. A servant, not a ruler. When the ego no longer drives your actions, life begins to move through you rather than being forced by you. And this movement is intelligent, spontaneous, deeply connected. There is no longer a need to grasp or push, to impress or defend. You live in alignment with something far beyond what the ego could ever understand. An inner knowing that has no name, yet feels more intimate than your own heartbeat. Truth does not arise with fanfare. It arises in stillness. It arises when the last mask falls and you are no longer performing for anyone, not even for yourself. It arises when you stop running from silence and start listening to it. When you stop searching for who you are and start seeing what you are not. The death of ego is not the end of you. It is the beginning of what has never ended. It is the clearing away of all that is false so that what is real can finally be seen, not as an idea, but as the very ground of your being.